Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the most compelling ideas and enduring questions. Today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental to every society, the very nature of leadership and power. We're going on a deep dive into two of history's most influential political thinkers, Plato and Niccolò Machiavelli. And we'll look at their surprisingly different, yet maybe sometimes intersecting, visions for the, let's call it the ideal prince or leader.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, isn't it? Comparing figures from, vastly different times. Ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy are worlds apart.
Okay.
But our mission today, I think, is pretty clear. Let's try to pull out the core ideas, the responsibilities, the key characteristics of the leaders they imagine. And importantly, let's try to move beyond the common stereotypes to really get at their relevance for you listening today.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting with Plato, often called the greatest philosopher ever, right? What was really driving him to come up with this ideal ruler? And why does he sometimes get labeled, maybe surprisingly, as anti-liberal?
Well, Plato's motivation was deeply personal. It really came out of his huge disappointment, his disillusionment with the trial and execution of Socrates, his mentor. That whole experience just propelled him to focus really intensely on how you build a truly just city, not just for Athens, but like universally. His approach was very theoretical, very abstract, aiming for this kind of perfect society based on eternal truths. Now, that anti-liberal tag, that comes mostly from later readings, people looking at his emphasis on, a pretty rigid social structure ruled by philosopher kings. It can definitely seem like it limits individual freedom, democratic choice, all in favor of some prescribed good, though we absolutely have to mention that Nazi ideology later twisted and misused these ideas, which is obviously tragic. But for Plato himself, the prince's role was fundamentally about the inner nature, the soul of this ideal city.
Right, so given that focus on the soul of the city, what practical responsibilities did Plato actually give his prince to, keep this ideal city going? He had this idea of decay, didn't he? That societies degrade, and the prince's duties were meant to stop that slide.
Exactly. Yeah, Plato saw this hierarchy, like 5 types of regimes, starting with the ideal city and then degrading all the way down to tyranny. And crucially, each step down was caused by, mistakes made by the prince, by the leadership. So the prince's duties are designed to prevent those specific steps. First, educating the successor. This is key to stop the first slip from the ideal city to aristocracy. You need new leaders who are just as virtuous, even though, everything eventually decays. Second, processing moral education on citizens. This is to stop the slide from aristocracy to oligarchy. Because if people lose respect for virtue, for morals, the whole system of specialization in the city breaks down. Third, maintaining the government's authority and fame. This stops the shift from oligarchy to democracy, where citizens suddenly realize their own power, and the prince might end up, despite losing prestige. And finally, increasing the employment rate. This is about stopping that final fall from democracy into tyranny. It's about preventing the rise of what he called drones, wrongdoers, loafers, who basically crumble the whole division of labor.
Wow, that is a really specific job description, almost like a preventative maintenance plan for society. So if you pull back, Plato's really saying that things like leadership development, fostering a strong ethical culture, they aren't just optional extras, are they? They're fundamental. For any group, really, you need those talent pipelines, those strong ethical guides, maybe more than just short-term wins. But okay, what kind of person was this philosopher king supposed to be? What were the core traits Plato thought were absolutely essential?
Right. The absolute most fundamental thing is that the prince has to be a true philosopher. And that doesn't just mean smart. It means someone who genuinely knows the eternal, unchanging truth of the world. Someone who can see past the illusions, the phenomena like wealth or honor. Building on that, Plato's prince, has skills really only designed for governing. So they might seem kind of useless outside that specific role. Think of like a brilliant ship captain who's maybe not physically strong. And this is crucial. This leader does not actually want to rule. True philosophers see things like money and power as, basically illusions. So they're kind of immune to corruption. In theory, they can't compromise with badness. They're always striving for actual, literal goodness and virtue in the city. And they don't get bummed out by failure because they know objective good exists, regardless. This prince isn't fooled by illusions of good, They can easily tell the difference between shadows and reality. And finally, and this is pretty provocative, they operate beyond common sense.
Beyond common sense,
Yeah.
Okay. Like that idea of potentially harming few to benefit many, while still demanding honesty from everyone else. How did Plato square that with all the emphasis on virtue? Doesn't that edge towards tyranny itself, kind of a departure from normal morality?
Yeah, that's the tension, isn't it? That's what makes Plato so, endlessly debatable. For him, the philosopher king's actions, even if they look weird or harsh to us, are always guided by that knowledge of the absolute good. So harming few to benefit many isn't about being cruel. It's like this ultimate, almost mathematical calculation for the city's overall health, seen through the lens of pure truth, not just, popular opinion. The prince is sort of above common morality because they're operating on this higher enlightened level. And the risk of tyranny. That's exactly why Plato insists the ruler must be a true philosopher, someone who genuinely lacks that personal hunger for power. They're almost like an instrument of justice, not a self-serving ruler.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Let's shift gears completely. To Machiavelli, often called the leader of the first wave of modernity in political philosophy. What was his motivation for his ideal prince? And how did his whole approach just clash, really, with Plato's abstract ideals?
Well, Machiavelli was looking around him and was just deeply, profoundly troubled by what he called the fading away of Italy. It was fragmented, weak, constantly being invaded, humiliated. So his motivation, his driving force, was all about restoring the glory, the fame, the unity of the state, his state, and his method. Totally different from Plato, intensely practical. He looked at historical examples, real-world politics, how things actually worked or didn't work, a complete contrast to Plato's abstract arguments about ideal forms. Machiavelli's prince also had a much wider lens, dealing heavily with war, with international stuff, things Plato in his ideal city kind of glossed over.
Right, so much more grounded in the messy reality. So what were those practical, almost how-to responsibilities Machiavelli set out? To physically, strengthen and glorify the country. He really dug into history for these, didn't he? Like specific examples.
Oh, absolutely. History was his textbook. He saw 5 key responsibilities, all drawn from historical lessons, basically. First, giving laws. He pointed to things like the Roman land reforms. Carelessness there, he argued, led straight to autocracy, social strife. So get the laws right. Second, governing the country. Making mistakes dealing with political rivals, like Cosimo de' Medici did, could be incredibly damaging. You have to be smart about internal politics. Third, developing the military. Just essential. Non-negotiable for strength. He used the example of a Greek emperor who failed at this and ended up in servitude under the infidel. Strong military equals security. Fourth, diplomacy. Super critical for national security. He pointed to Rome messing up by not supporting the Samnites, which basically invited the Latins to attack them. You need allies, or at least smart positioning. And fifth, maybe the most controversial, extending domination. For Machiavelli, this wasn't just defense, it was almost a goal in itself. He argued Rome destroying its neighbors led to a huge population, which then fueled its military and its overall greatness. Expansion equals power.
Okay, so definitely not a philosopher in an ivory tower. Machiavelli's prince is a strategist, focused on tangible results, even if they're, ruthless results sometimes. It's about getting power, keeping stability, projecting strength. A clear lesson for any leader, I suppose. Results count, and sometimes tough calls are needed for the long game, for the health of whatever you're leading. Now, obviously, Machiavelli's name. It's basically become shorthand for ruthless, manipulative leadership, right? But beyond that stereotype, what characteristics did he actually say his prince needed? He had those famous animal analogies, the fox and the lion.
Right, the fox and the lion. He identified 5 critical characteristics, and some might surprise you, actually. First, he suggested a deep-seated trend not to hurt mankind, meaning evil methods. They're only used out of necessity for a good outcome. He actually really disliked and criticized genuinely brutal tyrants. Second, an overwhelming love of fame. This, for Machiavelli, was the strongest motivator. It pushed princes to do great things, things that would glorify the state. He even knocked Caesar for apparently lacking this enough. Third, possessing his own morality. Now, this is tricky. It means the prince might do things considered evil by, say, common standards, or Christian morality, maybe breaking his word, maybe worse, but these acts are justified by this sort of alternative morality that serves the state's good. Fourth, being familiar with tricks, like a fox. Not just to spot deception in others, but to actually use tricks skillfully yourself, to avoid being outplayed. Cunning was essential. And finally, being a profound lover of military force, constantly training the army, mastering warfare, always displaying military power to deter enemies. He contrasted this with, like a Macedonian king who tried to impress invaders with gold instead of soldiers. Big mistake, in Machiavelli's view.
It's fascinating how he puts that trend not to hurt mankind right alongside having his own morality that might allow for, pretty extreme actions. That sounds like a massive ethical tightrope to walk. So let's tackle that head on. Machiavellian, it's a common term. There's even that psychological scale, the Mach-Vier, right? Synonymous with being ruthless, manipulative. But you're saying based on the sources, that's a huge oversimplification. What's the real moral agenda, if any, behind Machiavelli's advice?
Yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head there. That popular negative image, fueled by centuries of condemnation, even Shakespeare chipping in, it mostly comes from a pretty superficial read. You have to remember, Machiavelli wrote this stuff from personal experience. He'd seen political chaos. He'd even been tortured. He saw evil as, like, human-caused. And he believed the leader's job was actually to reduce it, to ameliorate it. His ethic is really one of compromise and necessity. When he talks about a prince doing bad things, it's almost always framed as choosing the least bad option. In situations where, frankly, something bad's going to happen no matter what you do. And that Mach 4 scale you mentioned, yeah, it measures manipulative tendencies, cynicism, amorality. But interestingly, Machiavelli himself would probably score somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
His advice was situational, pragmatic, not about being inherently nasty.
Okay, can you give us some concrete examples? This least bad approach. How does it connect to actually establishing social order rather than just, being cruel for the sake of it?
Sure. Take his most famous or infamous piece of advice. It is much safer to be feared than loved, if you can't be both. Now, that sounds harsh, but it wasn't him saying, be a tyrant. It was a pragmatic observation about human nature. In a world with lots of untrustworthy people, fear, but crucially, fear without hatred, provides more reliable security for the ruler and the state than love does. He strongly advised avoiding actions that cause hatred, like seizing property, messing with people's families, especially women. He insisted any executions needed proper justification. He even defended Caesar Borgia's actions, calling his methods cruelty well used, like publicly executing a brutal minister after order was restored in Romagna. Machiavelli argued that was actually much more merciful in the long run than letting chaos continue. It was all geared towards one goal, establishing union and lawfulness. That, for him, was the ultimate good for the state.
Okay, that reframes it quite a bit. And what about arming citizens? That just seems so anti-Machiavellian if you only know the stereotype. It sounds like the opposite of a tyrant consolidating power.
It really is.
Yes.
And it's one of his most radical and, often overlooked ideas. Machiavelli argued, explicitly, that new princes should never disarm their subjects. Just the opposite. They should give them weapons. Why? Because it empowers the people, it makes them loyal, it turns potential subjects into active supporters, partisans. He saw good laws and good arms as the absolute foundations of any strong state. He much preferred a national army made up of armed citizens, people who were loyal, united, fighting for a common cause over unreliable, hired mercenaries. In a way, it actually anticipates some modern ideas like employee empowerment, shared leadership, getting buy-in from people. It completely cuts against that simple autocratic stereotype. He saw strength in a unified, armed populace, not a terrified, suppressed one.
Okay, so despite these massive differences, Plato's abstract perfection versus Machiavelli's gritty realism, did they actually share any core belief about how to fix society's problems?
Yeah, interestingly, they kind of did. Both of them, in their own ways, seemed to believe the primary solution wasn't just tweaking the political system, the regime type. It lay mainly in the improvement of the prince, the leader themselves. They both recognized that even the theoretically best system could fall apart if the leadership was flawed. It really underscores how critical the leader's own character and abilities are.
So, bringing it to today then, what can you, listening to this, really learn from Machiavelli, especially given the ironies around his own life and the actual impact, or maybe lack thereof, of the prince?
It is truly fascinating, isn't it? The Prince, for all its fame and infamy, didn't really become this systematic guidebook for rulers. It didn't spark revolutions like, say, Rousseau or Marx did. I mean, the guy he dedicated to, Lorenzo de' Medici, probably didn't even read it. Its lasting value, as one scholar puts it really well, is maybe in how unflinchingly it lays out the world from a strictly demoralized perspective. How it redefines virtue not as moral goodness, but as raw effectiveness, foresight, completely detached from traditional morality. It sort of forces you to look at the world as it is, maybe, not just how you wish it were.
But there's that killer twist to the pragmatism, isn't there? Especially with Cesare Borgia, his star example.
Oh, absolutely. The ultimate irony. Machiavelli holds up Borgia as the pinnacle of virtue, the master of seizing and holding power through skill and decisiveness. And yet, how was Borgia ultimately defeated? Not by a clever enemy, but by fortuna, by sheer bad luck. Specifically, his powerful father, the Pope, dying suddenly, combined with Borgia himself getting struck down by a near-fatal illness at the exact worst moment. It throws this profound question mark over everything, doesn't it? Machiavelli's radical realism, this idea that any means are justified if they work. Maybe it's ultimately doomed never really to flourish because you just can't account for or control sheer chance, those unpredictable human and cosmic forces. Maybe reality, as one writer suggests, can't be seduced by realism alone. Maybe it needs something more, something like transrealism, the power to imagine and call forth a reality that isn't here yet. Which makes you wonder, right, what does that mean for your ability to actually shape things?
So we've gone from Plato's almost ethereal philosopher king, designed perfectly for this ideal, virtuous city, all the way to Machiavelli's intensely pragmatic prince, forged in the brutal fire of Renaissance power politics.
Yeah, and hopefully you've seen that the simple Machiavellian stereotype just doesn't cut it. It's far too simplistic. His work, okay, yeah, it sometimes advocates for harsh measures, but it seems it was ultimately aimed at creating lawfulness, social order, seeing that as the least bad option in what he saw as a pretty chaotic world. And his insights about, balancing fear and goodwill, maybe empowering citizens, grounding decisions in actual consequences, they still resonate, surprisingly so for leadership today.
And maybe the most compelling thing to chew on is that stark philosophical contrast between these two huge visions. And the question it leaves us with, if Machiavelli's hard-nosed realism, powerful as it is, can still be beaten by pure luck, by fortune, if reality isn't just about what is, but maybe what could be, what does that mean for your ability to actually make a difference, to shape the world around you?
Right. It leaves you with a pretty provocative thought, I think. What role does imagination, something Machiavelli seemed to hold in contempt, really what role does that play in truly effective, maybe even revolutionary leadership? The kind of leadership that calls reality to, transcend itself, to turn its prose into poetry. Something to think about.